Well, Ace Digital, you've won. I've made your bloody tutorial. Actually, it was pretty fun. Let's get into it, shall we? So the first step was very simple. I edited the footage. My video editor of choice these days is DaVinci Resolve, and honestly, it's great. I would totally recommend it to anyone who needs a video editor but doesn't want to use Adobe products. The editing was pretty straightforward. The only thing I'd say is take out a few frames just as your actor is shooting. That really helps sell the impact. Here it is without those frames taken out, and here it is with those frames taken out. Really packs more of a punch. So then I decided to export the video, and I made sure to remember the frame rate. Why does this frame rate still exist? CRT monitors have not been used for like 12 years. God damn it, stupid Americans. Anyways, after a bit of very necessary fixing, I got the frame rate to 30 frames per second and exported it. The only other thing I'd say before we move on to Blender is make sure your footage is as steady as possible. It doesn't need to be perfectly steady, but you don't want the camera to move down as it does in my video. Yep, I learned this the hard way. Actually, it was an easy fix since the camera just shot straight down, but you might not be as lucky. So we are now in Blender. This is where we're going to make the magic happen. I'm going to start by politely asking the default cube to leave, along with its companion point light. We won't be needing either of them. Then I'm going to go to front view and press Ctrl Alt number pad 0 in order to line the camera to our view. If you're not able to do this with a number pad because you don't have one, you're going to have to position the camera manually. It's not too difficult, hopefully, for you. And we're going to do a couple of things to set up this scene. This isn't actually going to be the scene that we're going to be doing the comping in. This is just for the flash. We're going to be creating two more scenes, one for smoke and one for the compositing. In this scene though, and in all of them actually, we want the right frame rate. And so we go to the output properties and set the frame rate to 30. I'm then going to select my camera, and in fact I'll go to camera view, and I'm going to go to this panel here, which is for the camera properties, and turn on background images. I'll then add my movie clip, and once it's fully loaded up, then you're ready to go. You might want to set the proxy render size to be something smaller, like 50%. This will help the video to run faster in the viewport. Everything else you should keep the same. I also know the length of this clip. This is 235 frames long. So I'm going to set it as such. And at frame 162, he fires. So, let's start creating the muzzle flash. The muzzle flash is created the exact same way it was in the old tutorial. We're adding a UV sphere. I'm going to go into edit mode, rotate it on the x-axis 90 degrees towards the camera, and then in order to create that sort of snowdrop effect, I'm going to press O to turn on proportional editing. Just select that first vertex and drag it out along the y-axis. Maybe turn up the fall off a bit. You can do that by scrolling, by the way. And that doesn't look too bad. Now, there's no way on earth that this is going to line up properly. We actually need to change a couple of settings in the cameras before we can make it line up properly. Now, I tried to find out what focal length my phone was in order to match it. It's at 4. I don't think it's 4 millimeters. Just to show you what that looks like. That's how small this object that's, what, a couple of meters away actually is. Yeah, I don't think that's right. So I found that 24 works absolutely fine for what we need. We can always position things manually, which is what I'm going to do. We're going to move the camera over a bit and rotate it along the Z until this sort of matches up. It might seem weird to position the camera to the flash instead of the other way around, but the reason is really for later on when we're doing the smoke and all of that. It just makes things a lot easier, especially knowing that the center of the scene is lined up to exactly where the shot is fired. So if you want to make it easier on yourself, you can press N to open up the side panel, go to View, and you can lock camera to view. So that means now, anywhere you look, the camera will also look. So, we're going to lock in those. Now I want the 3D cursor to line up with it, not the sphere itself. And that looks pretty good. All we want is for the sphere to be in the same direction, because we can still move this along the y-axis to make it fit better, like so. Now, make sure you turn off the lock to camera view, lock camera to view, and now you can escape that view. So let's make this look a bit more like an actual gunshot, or like an actual muzzle flash. We are going to start by going to the modifiers tab, and we are going to add a displace modifier. And we're going to create a new texture for it. Ooh, that's looking perfect. It's like a little balloon. Now, what we're going to do is change this to clouds. And there you've already got something. Now you can mess around with all these settings, including the colors. Turning up the brightness will make it just fatter all around, while turning up the contrast will just increase the points. If you want to make this look a bit more high resolution, you can always add a subsurf modifier and just move it up above. And of course you can always use a vertex group in order to decide which points exactly are affected and by how much. So I want the ones at the end to not be affected as much. I'm going to add a vertex group. I'm going to change the weight to 0.2. Press assign. Then in order to actually make that work, you need to go into the modifiers panel and select the vertex group. Ah yes. It would probably help if first of all I selected the entire front area, like so. Second of all, press Ctrl I to invert the selection. Bring that right up to 1 again. Press assign. There we go, that's more like it. So, the rule of thumb when it comes to muzzle flashes is that they're usually about the same size as the gun. So I'm going to make this one a little bit bigger. Maybe like so. Second rule of thumb is Hollywood isn't realistic and you should always go bigger. Right. Perfect looking muzzle flash right there. Would never be able to tell that's fake. Okay, so let's actually make this look like a flash. If you go to rendered view right now, well, you're not going to see much. First of all, there's no light in the scene, and second of all, it's a gray blob. What we're going to do is go into the materials panel, add a new material, but we don't want to use a principled BSDF, we want to use emission. And I know emission is built into the principled shader, but it only tends to work very well if you want it to shine white. I don't, so I'm going to use emission. Let's change that color to yellowish. Like so. And let's turn up the strength to something like 20. And now, bingo! All done. Perfect. No, so next we're going to have to go to the render settings and turn on bloom. And you're gonna notice that already makes a huge difference. Let's mess around with the bloom settings a little bit. I'm going to turn down the radius. Turn up the intensity, just slightly. And that's already a lot better. I'm also going to turn up the strength. It's better to look through the actual viewport rather than through the camera, as the background image is going to mess with it. Right, 221 was way too high. $40 seems pretty good. Let's change that color to be a bit more yellow. Like so. Now, you can still clearly see the outline, even in the normal viewport. Now, actually, I don't mind this. I think it adds to it. Because if you look at proper muzzle flashes, they do have a very clear outline. But it should be blurred a little bit. We're going to fix that later, so don't worry about it for the moment. Next, it would be a good idea to save this. As you can see, I have done this before. Right, so now that it's saved, it's time to make it appear and disappear. So if I go to the camera view, I can decide exactly what frames I want it to be visible and which ones I don't want it to be visible for. You can actually do this by going to the object properties and go to visibility. And here there's a button called show in renders, which is animatable. Now you could have mixed this with a transparent shader, but honestly there isn't any point. So I know that I want it to be visible frame 161. So I'm going to uncheck this and click on this little button here to animate the property. The other way you can do it is by hovering your cursor above it and pressing I. When it's this sort of olivey yellowish color, you know that it has a keyframe on it. On the next frame it is green, and so it is not keyframed. However, if you tick this, it is an orange color now, but it's not the same color as before, as you can see. And the reason is because the value has been changed, but it hasn't been keyframed. Let's keyframe it now. Always make sure that you click on this button and then click on this button, and not the other way around. Now normally, a muzzle flash would only appear for one frame, if not less. Sometimes there's half, and due to a rolling shutter, you only see half the flash, the top half or the bottom half. But in this case, because it's Hollywood, and because we want to make things look better, I'm actually going to leave it for a whole 2 frames. I know, I'm a real gangster, aren't I? So let's move to frame 164, turn that off, and keyframe it. And there we go. Now, to you, it may not look like anything happened, but in the viewport, it will. You could also animate the viewport if you wanted to match, so you know exactly what you're seeing. I don't think it's necessary. So next, let's create the smoke scene. The smoke scene will be rendered in cycles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a full copy of this first scene. And actually I should probably name them. So this one is going to be called Flash. This one is going to be called Smoke. in the smoke scene, we can start by deleting this flash. And then I'm going to change the render engine to be cycles. And there we go, we're good to go. Okay, so I'm going to create a circle. This is going to emit our smoke, or sort of. I'm going to go into edit mode, fill in with a face by pressing F. Looks like my screencast keys has been turned off. Let's turn that back on. And then I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees, or so it's facing forward. And let's scale this down until it's the size of the gun. Or rather of the hole. So, let's add our domain for our smoke. Anyone who has used smoke before knows the way this works. You add a cube and all the smoke will stay inside this cube. So let's scale the cube to fit the size we want. Actually, it's better to scale it in edit mode so then you don't have to apply the transforms. And I will turn off proportional editing. So I scale it along the y-axis first of all. Remember, this is going to be firing forwards, so there is absolutely no need for there to be any sort of gap behind this circle here. And I'm also going to scale it upwards. Okay, that should be good enough. Plenty of space to work with. Maybe move this back a little bit just so we don't have any errors. Okay, so we don't actually want the smoke to emit from the circle itself, because doing so will lead to very uniform smoke. What we want is to create a particle system and have the smoke emit from that. So let's add our particle system. I don't know what it is with Blender 2.8, but these circles are far too big. So that's the first thing I'm going to change. In the settings for the particles, which I will rename. So let's finally do what I was going to do. I'm going to go to viewport display and change the size from 0.1 to 0.01. Now, look at those beautiful little particles. They're actually small now. So, at the moment, it really doesn't look like much. It's not working at all the way we want it to. I mean, we're not even on the gun part yet. So, let's change a few settings here. First of all, we do not need that many particles. Let's bring that down to 200. Next, I'm going to set the start frame to be 161, 162, 161, 163. Again, these are like 2 frame differences, so no one's going to notice. Okay, next thing is the lifetime. We don't actually want the lifetime to be that long. We only want it to be like 2 or 3 frames, maybe 4. Let's set it to 4 frames for the moment. And so now, if we press play, well, it might be the weakest gunshot ever, but it's coming along, I guess. I'm going to change a couple of settings here. I'm going to set the start frame to 160 to make it easier. and set the end frame to be 180. So we kind of have a fair idea of what we're doing. Beautiful. Okay. So next, let's open up velocity. We want these to fire out along the normal. I'm going to set this to 8. Let's try 8. Perfect. Now let's make that a bit higher. 10. We're going to change this afterwards, but for the moment let's leave it at 10. I'm going to turn up randomize to be pretty high too, even 2 or something. This means that they'll sort of, all the particles will sort of spread out in different directions. Like so, rather than all going straight. And then I'm going to go down to field weights and bring the gravity down quite a bit. I don't want it gone completely, but mostly gone. So let's bring it down to 0.5. Cool. Right, now let's start setting up the physics. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select both the circle and the cube, and I'm going to press Ctrl A to apply scale and location. Don't worry if you don't have that pie menu, I just have a specific add-on installed. I'm going to first select this circle. I'm going to rename it. I'm going to call it the inflow, and I'm going to call the box domain. Can't really go wrong with that. Okay, in the physics panel, I'm going to add type fluid. I'm going to set the domain to be a domain, and I'm going to select the inflow to be type flow, flow type smoke, flow behavior, inflow. Now, let's start going through all these settings because they are complicated. Now, first of all, we want to change the flow source. We want this to be not mesh, but particle system. And let's grab that particle system. And here is the size of each particle. Now, when it's set to 1, the particle size will be very, very small. I'm going to set them to size 4, maybe 5. We'll probably change this later on. We're also going to click on the initial velocity. What that does is it means the smoke will travel in the same direction as its emitter. So it'll already have the velocity of the particle when the smoke is emitted. I think that's all we need to do. For the inflow anyway. Let's select the domain, and I'll leave the resolution the same at the moment. As you can see in 2.83, quite a few things have changed. But really, you don't need to worry about most of it. I'm going to change the cache location. I think that'll make it easier if it's on my other hard drive. As you can see, this isn't the first time I baked any cache, so let's just do that. So I'm going to turn on adaptive domain. I'm going to change the frame start and frame end. Frame start will be frame 160 and frame end will be 180. And you might be thinking, but don't you want it to continue on till the end? And you're absolutely right, I do. But we are just testing it out, and it's a lot easier to test it all out when you only have 20 frames to bake rather than 80. Now if you press play, you still don't see any smoke. That is completely normal. You actually need to bake the data every single time in Mantaflow. If you want to change that, you can change it from modular to replay. By doing that, it will be viewable in the viewport, but honestly I don't think it's necessary. So let's go through a couple of these other settings. Resolution divisions decide how detailed your smoke is. 64 is good for testing, but when you're ready you want to bring this up to 128 and then 256. Timescale changes exactly what you think. It'll make the simulation look like it's going faster. Let's leave this at 1, though I might put it up to 2 later on. Time steps you don't really need to worry about. All this stuff you don't need to worry about. Border collisions you don't need to worry about. Now the buoyancy, density and heat will make the smoke rise higher. If you're not sure what something does, you can just put your cursor over it and it will usually tell you what it does. Vorticity is an interesting one though. It basically adds rotation and turbulence into your smoke. So you might think, well, let's turn that up really high. But that really depends on what type of simulation you're doing. In this case, it's going to be quite wispy, and it's not going to be very thick smoke. So vorticity isn't actually recommended to turn up at all. You can try yourself, but you'll probably end up with particles that look a bit like this. Okay, so next is dissolve. Dissolve I am going to turn on. And what that does is it basically makes your smoke disappear over time. This time is set in frames, so I'm going to change this from 5 to 50. Checking slow, that should always be checked. It just makes it look better. Noise is the same thing as high resolution from the previous version of Blender. I also find that it has the same effect as vorticity, where it just makes it look bad, so I wouldn't recommend turning it on now. But if you do turn it on, and you find that you ran the simulation and it doesn't look like it's showing, it's probably because this is turned on and it hasn't been baked. So just keep that in mind. If you see nothing in the viewport even though you baked the data, it's probably because noise is on. Fire, guides, and everything else you probably don't need to worry about, so let's just press bake and see what happens. So the bake is now done. Ooh, that looks beautiful. Okay, so turns out that the particles might have a bit too much energy for the smoke. As you can see, it's flying off. But before I change that, I am going to do a couple of other things. First of all, I'm going to add in a force field of type turbulence. And I'm going to move that forward a bit. I'm not sure whether it matters where it is in the scene, but I have found that it does. Now, turbulence is quite interesting because it doesn't make anything going in a particular direction. It'll just sort of spread out and swirl around, which is what I want my smoke to look like. I'm basically using this instead of vorticity. So strength is pretty straightforward. I'll set that to a 5 for the moment, but I may turn that up later. Size is how big you want your swirls to be, and I usually set this to be 0.1. You can make it higher or lower, up to you. Of course, this is all going to come with testing. Flow is kind of hard to explain, but imagine if the smoke was made up of particles and all these particles just went out in all random directions. That's what would normally happen. But by turning up flow, some particles will start to follow each other. In my previous attempts, I've had this at 2, and I find that it works very well. Let me free the data and bake it one more time. So in the final smoke settings, I took the vorticity up to 0.5 for the domain, and I also took the resolution up to 128. I didn't need to bring it up to 256, but your mileage may vary. For the inflow object, I took the particle size down to be a little bit smaller, and for the particle settings, I brought down the normal velocity to 5 meters per second rather than 10. And that did a pretty good job. So, what can we do now? Well, let's add the material. So I'm going to select the domain. I'm going to add a new material. And by default, it adds the principled BSDF. We want to remove this and instead add a principled volume. I'm going to go to the shading tab now. Go to camera view, and I'm going to go to rendered view. Now, as you can see, the box is visible above the image. We don't want this, and since we need to do it later on anyways, what I want to do is go to the render properties, go to film, and turn on transparent. Now, as you can see, it's very hard to see the smoke, and the reason for that is very simple. There aren't any lights in the scene. So I'm going to add an area light. I'm going to go back to solid view so I can see a bit better. And I'll move it above my smoke. Now, the lighting should really be up to you, but you're trying to match the setup of your actual image as best you can. Now, the first time I did this scene, I actually modeled out the entire room in order to get perfectly accurate lighting. And I can tell you, it is not worth it. All I did this time was put a cube in front of one of my lights in order to match it closer to what was in the scene. Remember, we're only going to see this for like half a second, so don't worry too much about it. So if we go back to the shading tab and we select our lovely domain here, you can see that it's very difficult to actually see the smoke. So I'm going to turn up the density to 20. Right, 20 is a bit high. $10 looks good. It's always better to have it too thick rather than too thin, because you can always just turn down the opacity in order to make it a bit thinner. Now, one thing I'm also going to do is add a plane underneath it to get some good bounce light. So now the final step. I'm going to create a new scene again, but this time you can just set it to new. It doesn't need to follow any other settings. I'm going to make sure that the frame rate is still the same, and no, it's not. I'm also going to set the output, as this is the one that everything is going to be saved to. Now, if you're planning on color grading in a different program, such as DaVinci Resolve, which I am, I'd recommend you also set the color depth to be 16 bits. It gives you more colors to work with. Next, I'm going to go to Render Properties, and I'm going to go to Film, and, not Film, Color Management, and I'm going to make sure that the View Transform is standard. You want this one to be standard, as we're going to be dealing with the footage. The other two, however, the other two scenes should be filmic, as we are rendering stuff out. I'm going to rename this scene Comp, and let's get started. Let's go to the Compositing tab, turn on Use Nodes, and I'm going to change this render layer to be Flash. Then I'm going to duplicate it and change this layer to be Smoke. So we have our two render layers. Next, we need our video. I'm going to press Add Image rather than Add Movie Clip, and I'm going to open it up. Frames I'm going to set to be 235. As well as the videos. Auto refresh is already turned on, and everything else should be good. So there is one last input we need, and that is a mask. See, we want this flash of light coming from the gun to actually shine onto my brother. And so to do that, we're going to use a mask, and I'm going to go to the image editor, and I'm going to grab this muzzle flash, just play through it quickly to prefetch the frames. Right, so if your image stops at frame 100, it's probably because it's not set up here. I'm going to just press the refresh button and that'll just fix it. Everything should be working fine now. Let's go to frame 162, where he fires. Change this from view to mask. And then we can start adding a mask. So press new, and then hold down Control and click where you want to create the mask. Now first I'm going to do his arm. If you click, then it just creates a point. If you click and drag, it creates a curve, like so. This doesn't need to be perfect. And if you want, you can press V to change the handle type. Setting it to auto will just make it automatically smooth itself. But if you set it to align single, you'll have it the same as the others. And setting it to vector will just make it a point again. So when doing the masking, first of all I cut out the parts on his arm and his forehead that were going to be lit up. And later on I decided to cut out a bit of his shirt too. Then I wanted light on the background too, so I cut out his shape to insinuate shadow. And it ended up working out pretty well. And there we go. It'll do. Let's go back to the compositor and select our mask. Now we are definitely ready. I'm going to start by adding in a viewer node, bringing it out so we can see what we're looking at. If you press V, you can scale in the background image that you're looking at. I'm then going to go back into the individual scenes and press F12 so we have something to look at. Make sure in the flash scene the background is set to be completely black. That is necessary. Then the smoke scene, the background should be transparent. So now this frame's rendered out. And now we can go back to comp. We have something to work with. I'm going to start with the mask, as this is the easiest to do. I'm going to press Shift A, go to Filter, Blur, type of Gaussian, and set this to be something like 30 in each direction, and plug the mask into there. Then I'm going to add a color balance node to this image. And I'm going to bring up the gamma. The lift and the gain are pretty useless. Gamma is the only one that matters. And you can see what you're doing if you plug in the viewer node. I'm using the Node Wrangler add-on, so I can press Control, Shift, boom. Let's bring that way up and give it that yellowish tint. So, this was it before, this is it now. Talk about a stark contrast. But how do we actually get them to blend together? Well, that's very simple. All you need is an alpha over node. What you do is you plug the original footage in and also the color balance footage in. You want the color balance footage to be the bottom one. And the reason is the bottom one is always the one in front. Why? I don't know. I feel like it should be the opposite way around, but Blender will be Blender. Then plug the blur, Gaussian blur, into the alpha over. And there you go. Easy as pie. So I also colored in his t-shirt a bit, and I think that looks a lot better already. Great. Perfect. Let's move on. Now there is one problem, and that is that we cannot switch between the normal image and the mask. And the reason for this is there's no slider to animate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this alpha over node, and I'm going to plug the other end back into the original footage again. And what this means now is this slider controls whether we see the light or not. So let's go to frame 161 and press I over the factor in order to add a keyframe. Let's go to frame 162, turn that down to 0, and press I over the factor again in order to add another keyframe. And then move to frame 164 and bring that up to 1, and press I. And now you can see it blends between them all pretty well. Great. Now we can add the smoke on top. Let's duplicate this alpha over node. Plug in the smoke. Great. You may want to add a contrast node or anything like that in order to bring out the smoke a bit more. It is up to personal taste. Brilliant. And now finally we have our actual flash. And then we're done, guys. So this time we're not adding an alpha over node. We are going to be adding a mix node. And we're going to set this to be not mix, but add. And plug that in. Voila! Now you might find this to be a bit too overpowering, and you can just turn down the factor to change how strong you actually want it to be. If it's still white, you can always go back into the settings for the flash and turn down the strength from 40 to 20. Just don't forget to render it out again. And remember, you don't need to animate this factor because the flash will automatically disappear when it's all rendered out. Finally, when you're ready to render, it's as simple as getting this input right here, the last one, plugging it into the composite node, and then pressing Ctrl F12. So there you go. It's all done. Hope you're happy now, Ace Digital. This took me way longer than I was expecting. I think I'm gonna go to bed now. Alright. See you guys later.